Hello and welcome to another episode of the Brown Pundits Browncast. This is the 15th episode in our series of podcasts on the history of the Indian subcontinent. In this episode, we'll talk about the Vijayanagara Empire. Joining me as speakers in this episode are Shrikanth and Gaurav Lele. Welcome to the episode, gentlemen.
Hi Maneesh, hi Gaurav.
Hello.
Right, so let's get started. Shrikanth, when we talk about this period, when we talk about the Vijayanagara Empire, what are the sources that we use? What are the reference materials that we use if we have to talk about this period?
Sure. Yeah, so I think when we discuss the sources, it might also be interesting to dwell briefly on the historiography of the Vijayanagara Empire, on how our own understanding of Vijayanagara Empire has grown over time, right? And I think the study of this empire started in the East India Company period with the publication of the Mackenzie manuscripts and the works of some early bureaucrats like Mark Wilkes. So that was the time when Indologists started getting interested in the Vijayanagara Empire, and they started collating some traditional accounts of how the empire came about and also collecting inscriptional evidence on the same. But the first major systematic work on the Vijayanagara Empire was the work by Robert Sewell around 120 years ago. He wrote a book called A Forgotten Empire. And he called it his contribution to the history of India, right? So that was a pioneering work that brought this empire to light, so to speak, which the memory of which had dimmed somewhat by then, by early 1900s, right? So I think Sewell published his book, I think in the 1890s or early 1900s. And in that book, he relies almost exclusively on Portuguese sources to understand the Vijayanagara Empire, especially the works of Domingo Paes, who visited Vijayanagara during the reign of Krishnadevaraya, and also Fernão Nunes, who visited Vijayanagara about 10-15 years later, I think in the 1530s, right? And the travelogues of these two Portuguese travelers, Paes and Nunes, is actually published verbatim. The translation of it in English is published verbatim by Robert Sewell. He leverages these two sources primarily, and then, of course, he writes his own history leveraging these two sources, right? So Sewell kind of downplays the inscriptional evidence and also the enormous literary evidence, the literary sources in Telugu and in Kannada and in Sanskrit. And that's understandable because he perhaps didn't know these languages well enough. So his reliance was on the Portuguese sources and their translations in English, which existed at the time. And Sewell viewed Vijayanagara primarily as a kingdom which represented strong Hindu resistance against the advancing Muslim rule in the Muslim incursion into the south, right? So I think the way Sewell describes the rise of Vijayanagara Empire, it's pretty dramatic, right? He talks about how Ulugh Khan's invasions in the 1320s and 30s caused mayhem in the south, and it caused the decline of the Kakatiyas as well as the Hoysalas. And then around that time, you also had the Pandyas declining in the deep south and the rise of the Madurai Sultanate around 1330 or so. And that was around the time when this Hindu resistance emerged all of a sudden in the 1330s as a bulwark of sorts. And two brothers, Harihara and Bupka, they came under the influence of this Hindu sage named Vidyaranya. And they mounted the strong resistance to Muslim rule. And he also made it a point to emphasize that all the Hindu kingdoms submitted voluntarily to Vijayanagara, right? So they did not resist the advance of Vijayanagara, and they let the Vijayanagara, this upstart empire, they let it emerge without much resistance so that they could resist Islam. the forces from the north, right? So that was his narrative. That's how Robert Sewell approached Vijayanagara Empire, right? But about 10, 15 years later, I think the Indian historians took over the writing of the history of the Vijayanagara Empire. Most notably, one of our early history doyens, Krishnaswamy Iyengar, right? So he published a very seminal work, Sources of Vijayanagara History, I think in the 1910s, which is an important work. And in that work, he departs from Sewell, right? Sewell had relied primarily on the Portuguese sources to a great extent, that is, especially Pais and Nunes, right? Krishnaswamy Iyengar relied heavily on literature, especially Telugu literature, right? The wealth of poems and especially poems, lots of poems that exist in Telugu literature which touch upon various aspects of Vijayanagara Empire, and also inscriptions to a great extent, right? And he, for instance, he relied on this poem Parijata Abharanam. It's a Telugu poem which sheds some light on Krishnadevaraya's conquest of Orissa, with some passing references, right? So it's in that way he was able to correct some of the misconceptions that existed from the Portuguese sources by relying on Indian literary evidence, especially Telugu literature, right? And he also compiled a lot of the inscriptional evidence. I think about 10, 15 years after Krishnaswamy Iyengar, you had Nilakanta Shastri and his students, especially Venkatramanaya and T. Mahalingam, who took this field forward, right? Venkatramanaya actually collaborated with Nilakanta Shastri to write this work titled Further Sources of Vijayanagara History, which is basically a continuation of what Krishnaswamy Iyengar had written 15, 20 years ago, right? And in their work, they focus more on inscriptional evidence, as opposed to Krishnaswamy Iyengar, who had focused on Telugu literature. Shastri and Venkatramanaya, they emphasize more on the inscriptional evidence in Telugu, in Sanskrit, in Kannada, all across Vijayanagara Empire, right, to understand the empire better. And then you had Shastri student T.V. Mahalingam, who focused more on the social history of the Vijayanagara Empire, the administrative history, right? And around this time, there also emerged regional historians, especially Venkatramanaya and B.A. Salator, who took Vijayanagara history writing in different directions. So Salatore, I think he was a Kannadiga who studied in England. I think he wrote some works on Vijayanagara in the 30s, and he emphasized the Kannada origins of the Vijayanagara Empire, right? And he did a lot of work on the taxation system in Vijayanagara, and his view was that Vijayanagara is basically carrying forward the baton of the Chalukyas of Badami. So it's a continuing tradition, and he also viewed the founders of Vijayanagara Empire as Harihara and Bupka as having served under Hoysala auspices. So he viewed them primarily as Kannadigas. On the other hand, you have Venkatramanaya, who suggested that the founders of Vijayanagara, they actually came from Andhra. And I think that is the more mainstream view. The fact that the founders, they have Andhra origins, they've served under Kakatiyas, and they after the fall of the Kakatiya Empire, they were imprisoned and taken to Delhi, where they may have converted even to Islam. At the very least, they were recruited by the Sultan in Delhi, right? And the Sultan sent them back to Deccan, to their original homeland, to serve in his campaigns. And that is when they were reconverted to Hinduism by this great Advaitin sage, Sage Vidyaranya, who kind of impelled them to start their own kingdom, right? It kind of was a major inspiration behind the founding of the city of Vijayanagara, right? So I think that is the more mainstream view, the fact that they were of Andhra origin, right? So I think that kind of covers the sources, right? On how we originally relied on Portuguese sources, and then we moved to literary sources, especially Telugu literature, and then inscriptional sources, right? Yeah.
Right. Great stuff. So, if we were to look at the modern day map of India, where would one put the Vijayanagara Empire? What was the geographical spread of the Vijayanagara Empire?
Yeah, the Vijayanagara Empire, at its greatest extent, it covered much of the peninsula south of the Krishna River, right? South of the Godavari Basin, rather. I mean, to be honest, yeah. Because north of the Godavari Basin, you had the Gajapatis in Orissa, and of course, you had the Bahmanis in southern Maharashtra and parts of northern Karnataka, right? Who didn't have as great an extent, right? Even at their peak. And there were lots of clashes with the Bahmanis throughout the Vijayanagara rule, which lasted more than 200 years. And I think the Vijayanagara Empire did outlast the Bahmanis ultimately, right? So the empire originated in what is Hampi today. So that would be the Bellary district in eastern Karnataka, right? So that is where the empire originated. And at its greatest extent, maybe during the rule of Krishnadevaraya, it covered much of the peninsula to the south, right? And in its northern borders, it was constantly in opposition to the Bahmanis, and after the Bahmanis, the Deccan Sultanates, which succeeded the Bahmanis on the west, and the Gajapati rulers of Orissa on the east, right? Yeah.
So, with Gajapatis to the north and east, present-day Andhra, parts of Karnataka, parts of Tamil Nadu, that would be the Vijayanagara
and much of Kerala as well. Yeah,
much of Kerala as well.
Basically, the four southern states to a great extent. Yeah.
Right. Shrikanth, who were the early rulers? So you mentioned the two brothers who started this, but let's throw some light on who were the early rulers before we come to the pivotal figure of the empire, Krishnadevaraya. Who were the early figures?
Right. So when we talk of Vijayanagara, there are basically three or four? In fact, there are four dynasties in the Vijayanagara Empire which succeeded one another, right? So it started with the Sangama dynasty, to which the founders belonged. That's Harihara, and the founders were Harihara and Bukka. They were two of the five brothers of a chieftain named Sangaraya, who likely had his origins in Andhra. They were probably in the service of the Kakatiya king, Prataparudra. And after the decline of Kakatiya rule, as I mentioned, I don't want to repeat myself, they were imprisoned by the Sultan. They went to Delhi, and the legend goes that they converted to Islam. They were recruited by the Sultan, and they came back to the Deccan, and that's when they kind of discovered their roots. Their conscience was awakened by the sage Vidyaranya, right? I think the founding of Vijayanagara is described in certain inscriptions and also in certain traditional accounts in certain Telugu literary works, and it dates to about 1336. That's when Vijayanagara was, the city was kind of inaugurated, so to speak, right? And the deity of the town was Virupaksha. And I think the Virupaksha, some form of the Virupaksha temple probably dates to that period, right? And these two founders, they were definitely under the inspiration of this great sage Vidyaranya, who headed the Sringeri Matha, right, in Karnataka, right? So Sringeri Matha is one of the four Shankara Mathas, right? We don't know much about the Shankara Matha prior to Vidyaranya. For all you know, maybe the Matha itself is of 14th century origin, though that's a radical thought. Nobody would agree with that. I think the traditional account is to place the Matha founding in the 8th century with Adi Shankara himself. But we don't know much about the Sringeri Matha between 8th and 14th century, right? So in the 14th century, you had this great figure of Vidyaranya, who was a scholar, and many works are attributed to Vidyaranya. And he appears to have inspired these two brothers. And the elder brother was Harihara the first, who ruled from about 1330s till about 1340s or 50s, I think. He didn't last too long, if I'm not wrong. And his younger brother Bukka, his rule continued till the 1370s. He ruled for a very long time. They inaugurated the Sangama dynasty, which continued till about the late 1400s, more than almost 150 years. Right? So there were many kings in that dynasty. So you had Harihara and Bukka, and then Bukka had many sons, one of whom was Kumara Kampanna, who never became the king, but he was the prince, he was the eldest king, prince, the Yuvaraja, so to speak. And he actually helped end the rule of Madurai Sultanate. And he managed to liberate the city, the temple city of Madurai from Muslim rule. And he also liberated the temple town of Srirangam from Muslim control, right? So I think worship resumed in Srirangam. I think I touched upon it in the last call as well. In the temple town of Srirangam in the deep south, in the Trichy district of Tamil Nadu, worship was, I think, discontinued for about 30-40 years because of the raids from the north, Malik Kafur's raids and then Muhammad bin Tughlaq's raids, right? And that was restored by Kumara Kampanna in the 1370s or so. And his achievement is celebrated in the great Sanskrit poem composed by his own wife, Ganga Devi. It's called Madhura Vijayam. And that's one of the important sources of how her husband, the Prince of Vijayanagara, managed to end Madurai Sultanate rule and also liberate the temple town of Srirangam, right? But Kumara Kampanna never became the king. I think he died in the 1370s. So the next king was, I think, I forget his name. I can check my notes. Just give me a second. Harihara II. Harihara II, who I think was the son of Bukka the First, right? And Harihara II continued till the 1400s, and then you had a few other kings, Devaraya the First, Devaraya the Second, and during this period, the city had grown considerably, and so had the empire, right? And there were many wars fought with the Reddy kings, the Velama chieftains, as well as the Orissa Gajapatis. So much of the south had already come under Vijayanagara rule by 1420s or so. And after Devaraya the Second, I don't think there were too many powerful monarchs. I think the empire kind of declined a bit, and there were also some setbacks against the Bahmanis. But a new dynasty came about in the 1480s or 1490s, and that was as a result of a coup by a general named Saluva Narasimha. So he inaugurates the Saluva dynasty, which was short-lived. So the Sangamas were overthrown after 150 years, and the Saluvas ruled for about 20-30 years, if I'm not wrong. And the most distinguished ruler of that dynasty is Saluva Narasimha. I think it was just one generation. Saluva Narasimha died when his son was still a minor, and that's when one of his generals, who was, I think, whose name was Narasanayaka, whose origins are probably in coastal Karnataka, he took over the reign of the dynasty, and that inaugurates the third dynasty, the Tuluva dynasty. And that starts with Tuluva Narasanayaka around 1500 or so, 1490s. And it was his son who was Krishnadevaraya. It's probably the most famous of all the Vijayanagara kings, and he ruled from about 1509 to 1529. And after Krishnadevaraya, there was again dynastic confusion, and you had the rule of Achyutaraya, was, I think, a half-brother of Krishnadevaraya. So that's a continuation of the Tuluva line. And then the de facto rule of the son-in-law of Krishnadevaraya, Ramaraya, who is pretty notorious in Vijayanagara history. And a lot of people attribute the decline of Vijayanagara to Ramaraya. And finally, you had the great defeat of the Vijayanagara Empire against the coalition of sultanates, the Deccan sultanates, right, in 1565, in the great battle of Talikota, and following which the city of Vijayanagara was basically destroyed, and it became something of a ghost town, so to speak. But the Vijayanagara dynasty continued. I think they shifted capital to a place in Andhra. I think it's Penukonda near Anantapur. And that is where the Aravidu dynasty continued. That's the fourth dynasty. So I spoke about the Sangamas, who lasted 150 years, the Saluvas, the Tuluvas, and finally the Aravidus. The Aravidus are, I think, basically the continuation of Ramaraya's line. And that line continued after the Battle of Talikota, where the Vijayanagara Empire basically met its end. But even after that, the empire continued in a nominal way in a different place. It was no longer based in Vijayanagara, though the dynastic line continued and several rulers in the south continued to pay lip service to in terms of their loyalty to the Vijayanagara ruler. Right, I think that continued for about 100 years, well into the 1600s. Yeah.
Right. Gaurav, your thoughts? Right.
Yeah, so one of the funny incidences for the listeners of pop culture might be there was a kind of a not exactly a red wedding kind of thing, but a kind of coup organized against Devaraya by one of his generals. So that it is not very popularly known. So even I have not been able to read the first-hand accounts or any strong sources for that. But Shrikanth, are you aware of that massacre which was taken over, like which was coordinated by a wazir or prime minister of Devaraya, and then he invited everyone 2-3 days and massacred them, and then Devaraya escaped it.
Yeah, I think I've read about it. I think you're referring to the Sangama ruler Devaraya the second,
Yes,
right?
first
In
or
the
yeah,
early 1400s, in the
yes,
1400s. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that is mentioned in some Muslim sources, if I'm not wrong. But I forget the details. Yeah.
Yeah, so the details are not very like we cannot confidently ascertain what happened, but
So this is more in the realms of popular imagination, is it? One of those
no,
stories you hear about.
it definitely happened, but we don't know the details. So there were attempted coups. So people were invited, large nobles were invited, and they were slaughtered during their dinners, lunch, like during when they were having food. So that is there, but yeah, but
Yeah,
not.
I mean,
Yeah,
correct. And also as I mentioned, in two cases the dynastic switch happened because of coups of sorts, right? The Saluva ruler Saluva Narasimha taking over from the Sangamas in the 1480s or so, and then the Tuluva Narasanayaka taking over about 10-15 years later. I mean, those were coups as well, coups of sorts. Yeah.
yeah,
Right. Right. So let's talk about then the man who's often identified as the man of Mr. Vijayanagara himself, Krishnadevaraya. Shrikanth, how do we know about Krishnadevaraya in the first place? Are these the same sources that we referred to at the beginning of the episode, or is there a autobiography or a biography that's been published, that was published in his time or after he died, and that's been translated? Do we have any primary sources specific to Krishnadevaraya himself?
Yeah, lots of primary sources, most notably the two Portuguese chroniclers, right? Domingo Pais and Fernando Nunes. Domingo Pais, I think, visited Vijayanagara during Krishnadevaraya's heyday, right? I think his visit was in the year 1520, and Krishnadevaraya ruled from 1509 to 1529, right? So he refers to Krishnadevaraya by name, right? So there's absolutely no ambiguity there, and he goes into considerable detail into the kind of king he was, right? His daily routine, what did he look like, right? How he used to start his day, right? How he used to arbiter justice, what were his likes and dislikes, right? What was his relationship like with the Portuguese? All of this is dealt with in some detail by Domingo Pais, right? And it's mostly favorable. He gives a very glowing account, not just of the city of Vijayanagara, which is described in glowing terms, but also Krishnadevaraya, the person himself, right? And Nunes actually visited about 15 years later, after Krishnadevaraya's death. I think Nunes wrote his work in the 1530s when Achyutaraya was ruling. So Achyutaraya was the half brother of Krishnadevaraya who succeeded him, right? So Nunes also gives a detailed, Nunes's work is actually less of a travelogue, more of a history, right? So he gives a detailed history of the Vijayanagara Empire of the last 150 years, right? And that includes the reign of Krishnadevaraya. So you learn a lot about Krishnadevaraya from Nunes, though Nunes never saw him. It's about 20 years after him. And you also learn much about him, the first-hand information from Domingo Pace. And in addition to this, there's also the wealth of inscriptional and literary evidence in Indian languages, right? And Krishnadevaraya himself wrote many works, which are at least attributed to him. We don't know. He may have, his courtiers may have written it for him. That's a different matter. But he is regarded as a very accomplished poet in Telugu, especially, right? So one of the great Telugu poems, Amukta Malyada, is attributed to Krishnadevaraya. It's regarded as one of the 5 great poems in Telugu literature, right? So he was not just a great military commander, but also a scholar of sorts with some literary talents, right? Yeah. In fact, I can probably try to pull up some descriptions of Krishnadevaraya by this person, the Portuguese traveler, right? Domingo Pace. It's interesting. It's quite vivid. You generally don't get to see such detailed accounts of Indian rulers from that period, right? I know Babarnama is also equally detailed, and that is even more detailed because that's first hand, right? That's coming from Babur himself. But for those times, especially by Hindu standards, I think this is pretty detailed information. Try to dig it out.
While you do that, my mind goes back to Shyam Benekal's serial on Jawaharlal Nehru's book Discovery of India, where the episode on Vijayanagara Empire, Om Puri played the Krishnadevaraya, and there also I think Benekal uses or Nehru quotes the Portuguese sources, and there is actually a very vivid description of Krishnadevaraya and Vijayanagara kingdom.
Yeah. Yeah, never mind. I mean, I can get back to it.
Yeah, politically, one of the important events during the reign of Krishnadevaraya was a battle at Raichur, which sort of consolidated the power of Vijayanagar in the northern part of the Deccan Sultanate, so to speak. So that was a very important battle.
Yeah, there is more to Vijayanagara than Krishnadevaraya, right?
Yes.
To be honest, it was a pretty big empire long before Krishnadevaraya, even 100 years before Krishnadevaraya, right? In the early 1400s, it covered a great part of the peninsula, right? But there was a decline in the Vijayanagara Empire in the late 1400s. And I think with the rise of the Tuluva dynasty, the third dynasty that I mentioned, much of the territory which was once part of Vijayanagara Empire was retrieved, and Vijayanagara kind of regained its lost glory, so to speak, under Krishnadevaraya.
Yeah, so it is said that Krishnadevaraya ushered in the second golden age, so to speak, of Vijayanagara, and the first golden age was, as Shrikanth said, 100 years prior, during the first dynasty.
That's right. That's during the rule of Devaraya the first, Devaraya the second, right?
Yeah.
That
I think, the political coup which I mentioned, that is said to have begun some decline in the empire, because the Bahmanids started attacking when there was internal instability after that incident during the reign of Devaraya II. But so then only to rise up again under the third dynasty.
Yeah, I do recommend people to read the narratives of Pace and Nunes, right? It's quite remarkable because this is it's a bit of a treasure, right? To find first-hand accounts of from 500 plus years ago, right? And so, for instance, here's the description of Krishnadevaraya by Pace. The king is of medium height and of fair complexion and good figure, rather fat than thin. He has on his face signs of smallpox. He is the most feared and perfect king that could possibly be, cheerful of disposition and very merry. He is one that seeks to honor foreigners and receives them kindly, asking about all their affairs, whatever their condition may be. He is a great ruler and a man of much justice, but subject to sudden fits of rage. Right? So, I mean, it's quite vivid, right? And it's quite unusual to find such descriptions of Indian rulers from that period. I can't imagine such detailed descriptions of any other Hindu ruler pre-1500, right? It's hard to find, right? Yeah.
Right. Talking of Portuguese sources talking about Vijayanagara Empire, there is a question that I've often been fascinated by. Now, this is the first time, as far as we know, this is the early times of Portuguese interaction or European interaction with the subcontinent. How are these two people communicating? I'm presuming Krishnadevaraya or nobody in his court knows Portuguese. And the Portuguese, when they come here, don't know Kannada or Telugu or Sanskrit. So, I mean, this is a question that I've often wondered the first time I read about Thomas Roe visiting Jahangir's court. That how are these two parties sort of communicating? I know this is a little bit of a digression, but any thoughts on this? What do we know?
I'm sure some of the Portuguese did pick up the local languages. They must have. I think that's probably the only way the communication must have
the
happened.
missionaries did pick up the local languages.
Yeah, that's right. But obviously, I mean, if you read the accounts of Domingo Pais or Nunes, right, mispronunciations galore, right? So they mispronounced the name of Krishnadevaraya. I think he's called Krishna Rao or something, right? I mean, just about every Indian name is mispronounced, right? So obviously, they didn't have a good grasp of Indian languages. And we need to take their accounts with a pinch of salt, right? Having said that, got to also acknowledge the fact that these are first-hand accounts, right? And that has its own advantage, right?
Yeah. And the style of, like, I don't know, we have come to always regard the Western accounts or even Arabic accounts, and especially the Chinese accounts for their attempt at writing history. So
Right.
they had other like slightly different concerns than the Indian commentators, who had, how do we call it, not topical or political concerns, but wanted always to point out something larger than the thing they were narrating.
That's right.
Eternal stories or sorts. So that is
Exactly.
where I think we tend to always prefer these accounts. Yeah. And we were
And that is
talking.
where you have someone like Nilakanta Shastri who downplays literary sources, Indian literary sources, for precisely that reason. And he focuses mainly on inscriptional evidence, because the inscriptions tend to be more reliable. They are shorter, they are more to the point, right? They are more topical, right? Unlike literary sources, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and also a lot of Portuguese mercenaries were on side of the Vijayanagara Empire in many of the battles they had with the Bahmanis as well. So especially the like musketeers, I think the Portuguese musketeers or someone. So they were of crucial importance to some of the battles which Vijayanagar won against the Bahmanis.
Yeah, and I think Krishnadevaraya did attempt to negotiate with the Portuguese ruler of Goa, right? Whose name is Alfonso Albuquerque. I think it's probably the first ruler of Goa from the Portuguese side, and he negotiated with him to get a monopoly rights over horses, over the horse trade by the Portuguese. So he paid them a good amount of money and said, please sell all of your horses to me. Don't sell it to the Bahmanis or the Sultanate guys, the Muslims, right? And I'm not sure if Alphonse actually honored that, or maybe he died before that. I don't know. I don't know the detail on how that panned out. But it's interesting that I think the relationship with the Portuguese was fairly cordial, as far as I know. I don't think there were any military tussles in that period at all. Yeah.
Yeah,
However,
the Portuguese truly started overextending after the fall of Vijayanagar, even though they were there. So their tussles were more with the Bahmanis in the north. So if you go to Goa and some of the forts, so they constantly changed hands between the Adil Shahi and Portuguese over a time of 200 years. Not so much with the Vijayanagar who were to the south.
That's right.
Yeah.
Talking of Vijayanagara, I mean, if the duration of the Vijayanagara Empire, it's quite long. If you think about it, 1330s till 1560s, right? That is how much? 230 years. That's quite a long time for an Indian dynasty, right? And that's peak Vijayanagara. I'm not even talking about the nominal Vijayanagara rulers who continued in reduced form after 1560 for another 100 years, right? I'm not considering them, but the core Vijayanagara period itself is about 230 years. And to put that in perspective, I think that's probably longer than the core Mughal period, right? If you
Oh yes, far more than Mughal period.
Mughal era is from the core Mughal period is from Babur to end of Aurangzeb. I know after Aurangzeb you had many rulers, but their influence dimmed considerably. So
160 years max. Yeah,
1520s to 1700, right? Roughly, and that is less than 200 years.
Yeah. So Vijayanagara definitely around like 220 or 210, we can say, depending on.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
And they were a big power throughout Ramaraya's rule, right? Till 1560s. It's only in 1565 with the Battle of Talikota that the rule ended, so to speak.
Now, 2 points there. One, are we saying that the Europeans were getting horses to the peninsula via Goa? How were they doing it? I mean, that's fascinating. Were they getting horses from Europe?
I think they were importing horses from Persia, Persian horses.
Persia or Arabian horses, I think,
Yeah.
That's fascinating. The second point, we remember talking about and we've read Cholas going all the way to Southeast Asia. Did the Vijayanagara Empire carry forward that legacy? Do we have any evidence of
I don't think so. No, I don't think their navy was all that strong. I don't read much about Vijayanagara navy anywhere, right? I'm sure they had a navy, but I don't think it was as distinguished or as influential as the Chola navy.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't. The Portuguese and the French who were coming were far superior in the waters than Vijayanagara.
Right. So moving on, Shrikanth, what are the dominant religious movements of the Vijayanagara Empire? What is the religious milieu like?
Sure. So I think, as I mentioned, the founders, Harihara and Bukka, they were likely subordinate to the Kakatiyas in their early life, right? Before they founded Vijayanagara. And they were likely of Shaiva origin, Shaiva background, so to speak, right? And I think they definitely acknowledged the deity of Anegundi, that's the ancient principality around the Vijayanagara area, right? Virupaksha. That was the presiding deity of the city, and they were clearly Shaiva. And I think the early rulers were primarily Shaiva, if I'm not wrong. But that changed over time. I think Saluva Narasimha, the founder of the Saluva dynasty, he was definitely Vaishnava. And we probably had a Sri Vaishnava guru, if I'm not wrong, in the south. And the Tuluvas who followed were definitely Vaishnava, right? Krishnadevaraya was a very devout Vaishnava. And the poem that he composed, Amukta Malyada, it's one of the great classics of Telugu literature, right? It is a poem that describes the life of the Vaishnava Aivar, Periyaivar, and his daughter Andal, right? And I know we discussed the Aivars many episodes back, right? When we discussed the Deep South between 500 and 1000 AD, right? So it's interesting that these Tamil Vaishnava saints were being commemorated by Krishnadevaraya, who was by no means a Tamilian, right? So he was, his mother tongue was probably Kannada or Telugu, right? And he wrote this great Telugu poem that recounted the life of Periyaivar and Andal, right? So he was clearly a Vaishnava. Was he Sri Vaishnava or was he more inclined towards the Dvaita Sampradaya? That can be debated. I think he was also a disciple of Vyasatirtha, the great Dvaita guru, right? So I'm not super sure if he was if he regarded himself as a Sri Vaishnava or a Madhva, right? That can be debated, right? But he was definitely Vaishnava in his persuasion. And even today, when you go to Tirupati, near the Sanctum Sanctorum, you can see the statues of Krishnadevaraya and his two wives near the Sanctum Sanctorum, right? And it's still there. And I don't know when those statues were installed. Probably it goes back to Krishnadevaraya's time himself, but he was a great patron of the deity in Tirupati, right? And there's living proof of that even today. So every time you go for darshan, you can see Krishnadevaraya standing there with his two wives, right? As far as the religious movements of the time are concerned, it was a period of not a lot of innovation in religion, I would say, unlike the previous period that we discussed. So I think when we discussed in a prior episode, we spoke about religion quite a lot, right? Because we spoke about the schism that emerged within Sri Vaishnavism, right? The Tengalai and the Vadagalai Sampradayas, right? We spoke a lot about that. We spoke about the rise of Madhva's movement, the dualist movement in Karnataka, right? The Dvaita Sampradaya. There were no such sharp emergences of new movements or new thought movements in the Vijayanagara period. But what we saw was basically the consolidation of thought currents that had originated previously, right? So I think in the Dvaita landscape, you had someone like Vyasatirtha, who was, I think I probably mentioned him just a while back. He was the guru of Krishnadevaraya, and his origins are probably in the southern Karnataka, and he spent much of his early life in the Tirupati area, but in his later life, he moved to Hampi, and he served as a Vijayanagara diplomat. But at the same time, he was also a great philosopher, right, who wrote many important works that are classics in the Dvaita tradition, right? One of his major works is a text called Nyayamrita, which takes on Advaita, right? And it counters many of the Advaita assumptions. And that became a very notorious text in Advaita circles. Right? It created a lot of disturbance, so to speak. And Vyasatirtha's Nyayamrita was actually countered in a systematic way by Madhusudana Saraswati's Advaita Siddhi, which was a defense of Advaita against the charges leveled on it by Vyasatirtha, right? And Madhusudana Saraswati was Bengali, right? And he lived during the time of Akbar, a little later than Vyasatirtha, right? So he read Vyasatirtha's work and he wrote this great riposte or counter to it. And then there were Dvaita counters to what Madhusudana Saraswati had written. It's an interesting exchange that happened between Dvaitins and Advaitins between, say, 1500 and 1650 or so, right? It's quite interesting to read about it. But so Vyasatirtha was a very important figure. And I think recently he was in the news for the wrong reasons. I think his samadhi was tampered by some miscreants near Hampi. I think his samadhi is near Hampi, if I'm not wrong. I don't know where his samadhi is exactly, the location. I think it was tampered and it was in the news for the wrong reasons. But he's one of the great religious figures of this period, the Krishnadevaraya period, right? A philosopher, a diplomat, and he was also a patron of the Haridasas, the Kannada poets who emerged in the Dvaita tradition and who contributed greatly to Carnatic music's development, right? Most notably Purandaradasa and Kanakadasa. They were basically students, or rather proteges of Vyasatirtha, right? And Vyasatirtha himself composed quite a bit in Kannada as well. So he's known primarily for his very dense works in Sanskrit, like Nyayamrita, but he also wrote some devotional works in Kannada, like there is this famous song, right? Krishnani Begane Baro, who I think some of you may have heard of it, and that is a work of Vyasatirtha, right? So he's a figure that we must mention when we discuss this period. Besides the consolidation of the Madhva doctrine you also had, we also need to mention Vidyaranya himself, who was the patron saint of this whole empire itself, right? So Vidyaranya was not a Madhva, he was a Dvaitin. He was an Advaitin, sorry. He was the head of the Shankara Matha at Sringeri, right? And Vidyaranya was the one who actually egged these two brothers, Harihara and Bukka, to found the city, right? And he himself was a great scholar, right? So he has many works to his credit, Vidyaranya, right? One of his works is Sarvadarshana Sangraha, which is basically a compendium of all the philosophies known till then, right? With respect to Vedanta especially, right? So he discusses the Charvakas, the Buddhists, the Ajivikas, the Sri Vaishnavas, the Dvaitas, Dvaitins, and finally the Advaitins, right? So the way he presents his work is he discusses all these philosophies one after the other. He first discusses the philosophies that he considers most worthless, that would be Charvakas and the Buddhists, and then he proceeds to the more orthodox philosophies, Nyaya and other philosophies, right? And finally he gets into Vedanta, where he discusses Sri Vaishnavas, Dvaitins, and finally he presents his philosophy, which is Advaita philosophy of Adi Shankara, which he regards as the pinnacle, so to speak. So it's from an Advaitin standpoint, but it's an interesting book. It's a compendium of in Indian philosophy, so to speak, right? And probably the first such work in Indian tradition, right? Vidyaranya also has another work to his credit, a work named Shankara Digvijaya. It's probably the earliest biography of Adi Shankara that is still extant. So I know we all know that Adi Shankara lived sometime in the 8th century, but there's no biography of Adi Shankara till the 14th century. So Vidyaranya's work, Shankara Digvijaya, is the first traditional biography of Adi Shankara. So it's obviously not very reliable, as it's a 600-year lag, but it's important from a traditional standpoint, right? So he's an important figure. And Vidyaranya's brother was actually the great Vedic scholar Sayanacharya, who I did mention in our previous episode. I think some of these things were mentioned in the previous episode because the previous episode covered till 1400, right? So there's a bit of an overlap with the Vijayanagara period. So Sayanacharya was a great Vedic scholar who wrote one of the early commentaries on Rigveda Samhita and a lot of the other Samhitas as well, right?
Wasn't his work the first go-to thing used by the later Europeans to translate
Yeah, I think the likes of Max Muller, they understood Rigveda mainly through Sayanacharya's commentaries, right? So he was probably the first Indologist, so to speak, right? And is pretty influential. So he was actually, as per tradition, he's the brother of Vidyaranya, right? So he also lived sometime in the late 1300s, right? So that's briefly about the religious movements and important religious figures of this period. And there's also another interesting person named Vadiraja who lived in the Tulu country, right, in the coastal Karnataka. He was not living in Hampi, but he was nevertheless under Vijayanagara rule, right? So he's an interesting figure who composed a lot in Kannada, and much of his works are sung even today in many households in that region, right? And he actually streamlined the 8 mathas of Udupi, right? The Ashtamathas of Madhvacharya. Madhvacharya had founded these mathas, but Vadiraja basically systematized the administration of those mathas, and he set up this rotational system called Pariyaya, where the mathas take turns every 2 years to administer the Udupi temple, right? And that system continues to this day. So there are 8 mathas, right? Pejavara, Palimaru, Adamaru, Puttige, Sodhe, Krishnapura, Kaniyur, and Shirur. And they take turns to administer the Udupi temple every 2 years. And this system was set up by Vadiraja, and it continues to this day, right? So he's a very influential institution builder, so to speak, right? He was also a Madhva, of course, right? And he has written many important works that are important for Dvaita, from a Dvaita doctrine standpoint. Right?
Yeah, about religious thing, one more thing worth noting is this was also the time of the Bahmani Sultanate, and Bahmani Sultanate was sort of the main first Shia dynasty in the country. So a lot of even the uh, five Deccan sultanates who followed the Bahmanids were Shias. Some of the rulers, popular rulers like Ibrahim Adil Shah II, he went back to Sunni faith. But yeah, lot of the Shia Islam in India, especially one with Persianate exposure,
I think
can go back to this time also. Yeah.
Gaurav, I think the Bahmanis were Sunni though, if I'm not wrong. I think the succeeding
The
Deccan
succeeding,
sultanates
yeah,
were,
sorry, yeah, the Deccan Sultanates, the
yeah,
Adil Shahis and yeah,
Adil Shah, yeah, they were Shia, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, and even the Golconda Sultanate, right? The Hyderabad Golconda Sultanate. Were they also Shia? They might have been. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Bahmanis were cut off, like, yeah, they were the remainders of the commanders who, yeah, we discussed that during the Delhi Sultanate episode, but yeah, the Adil Shahi particularly were Shias.
Yeah. I know we didn't discuss Bahmanis in much detail, at least so far. So the Bahmanis were basically the Muslim power that emerged in Upper Deccan after the retreat of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, right? So they were originally Tughlaq chieftains who basically declared their independence, so to speak. And they emerged at around the same time as Vijayanagara Empire. So probably a little after the Vijayanagara Empire emerged. It's in the 1340s. I think the Vijayanagara was founded in the 1330s and Bahmanis emerged in the 1340s. And they were based in Bijapur in northern Karnataka. And they continued as a power till about 1500s. So they started around the same time as Vijayanagara, but their rule kind of ended about 50, 60 years before Vijayanagara collapsed, right? And the Bahmanis collapsed and they kind of disintegrated into 5 distinct Deccan sultanates. There was one in Ahmednagar, the Adil Shahi of Bijapur, the Qutub Shahi of Golconda, the Barid Shahi of Bidar, and the Imad Shahi of Berar. And I think that's what Gaurav was referring to. I
Yeah,
think many
the
of these
five
Shahis were
sultanates.
probably Shia. Yeah. 5 sultanates.
Yeah, and
Right.
yeah, so there was on the not just the religious front, but particularly if we come to the Adil Shahi, so that period did see some sort of I wouldn't want to use the term Indo-Islamic, but some sort of syncretic culture evolving, especially under the reign of Ibrahim Shah II, who ruled towards the end of the 16th century. So he was one of the rare Muslim rulers who actually had apparently a Hindu temple inside his palace built for his worship. He also is said to be a prolific musician or a singer. So he was a great patron of music, and he apparently also composed some prayers to Saraswati. So that is something which is not very commonly known. So he was the uh, last, so to speak, one of the, so the decline of the Adil Shahi and the rise of the Marathas. It started after a death of Ibrahim Adil Shah II, and also a madrasa in Bidar called Mahmud Gavan Madrasa was also built around 1500 or so by under the Bahmanis. So that also remains to be a sort of important monument, which also had some secular sciences, which were secular aspects of education which were studied. So it was not just a normal religious madrasa. And if we want to touch on the Bahmani period, we maybe just I will mention Firishta, or I don't know what his exact full name is, but is popularly known as Firishta, a
Yeah.
Persian historian per se who came all the way from Turan, from Caspian Sea or the Greater Persia, and settled in the court of the Adil Shahis. So he composed a lot of histories, and he also had some knowledge of he also acquired some knowledge of Ayurveda, Unani techniques, some Irani, Persian traditional sciences. So these also, the medical sciences of Ayurveda, Unani and others also sort of merged, and there were some systems of medical help which came up under the Bahmani and the later Adil Shahi period, which is a development worth mentioning here. So the works of Farishta called Tehriki Farishta is also very popular for history.
Correct. Farishta, though, I think he belongs to the early 1600s. He's not a contemporary historian, right? But he did write a lot on the history of many of these Muslim kingdoms, not just the Bahmanis, but also the Delhi Sultanate, right? So it's a very important source on a lot of the kingdoms. One contemporary source on the Bahmanis is a person named Abdul Malik Ismail. He wrote a work in Persian named Futuh us-Salatin. I think he's one of the contemporary historians of the Bahmani Empire. I think he was based in the Bahmani territory, and he was probably eyewitness to the Bahmani Empire's development, right? So that's another interesting source.
Yeah.
Sure. And when we talk of Bahmani Empire, we are talking of present-day Maharashtra and parts of North Karnataka. That's the geographical spread.
Yes.
Yeah, but their
some parts
extent
of
was definitely-
Andhra Pradesh as well.
Correct.
Telangana region.
Correct. Yeah.
But mostly Maharashtra. Yeah, predominantly Maharashtra.
The skirmishes with the Vijayanagara Empire started right from the foundation of both these empires, right? It's the 30s, 40s itself, right? And there were periods when the Bahmanis were reduced to a very small extent, right, by Vijayanagara, and the other way around, right? So there was an ebb and flow in terms of the fortunes of the Bahmanis and the Vijayanagaras, with the Vijayanagara Empire mostly being in the ascendant, I would say, right? Yeah. And it was during Krishnadevaraya's rule that the Bahmanis got disintegrated, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah. So the Battle of Raichur, which we talked about. So one of the not request, one of the commands Krishnadevaraya asked of the opponent was to literally come and lick his shoes or something very very condescending, or something which the other person could never come up with. So that is also one of the popular things known. So what is called as the Raichur Doab, which is the Krishna Tungabhadra region. So that was also the core area of contestation between Bahmanis and Vijayanagara. So it is a agriculturally very fertile region. So we talked about the Battle of Raichur where Krishnadevaraya won. So that region transferred from the Bahmanis to Vijayanagara after that, which led to the second golden age we talked about earlier. So yeah.
Correct. Yeah, makes sense.
Right.
And the Bahmani architecture also, which is found especially in the Deccan region, the Bahmani Muslim architecture, the Bahmani tombs, Chand Minar. So there is for the architecture nerds, they would understand that there is some difference between that and the architecture of the later Mughals, or the Sultanate period did not have much architecture up in the north. Nothing worth remembering apart from the Qutub Minar, as we discussed in the earlier episode. But there were some advances in the architecture in the Bahmani period in the south.
Yeah, coming back to Vijayanagara, one thing that I would like to touch upon is administration, right? How did this empire function? Of course, the capital was in modern day Hampi, right? And historians differ in terms of how centralized Vijayanagara Empire was. I think some of the early nationalist historians like Nilakanta Shastri, they probably overemphasized its centralized nature. Though in more modern times, I think historians like Bertenstein, the American historian, they have tried to de-emphasize the power of the monarch, and they have conceived of Vijayanagara more as a loosely held confederation of fairly independent provinces, right? That's Bertenstein's view. And probably that's more accurate as well. And let me give you a couple of examples here. The Tamil provinces of Vijayanagara, they were often ruled by very powerful local viceroys, so to speak, who were, of course, deputed or designated by the Vijayanagara monarch, but they were practically independent rulers, right? One example being Saluva Narasimha Nayaka, who is also known as Chellappa. This is different from the Saluva Narasimha, who was the Vijayanagara ruler himself, right? About a few decades before this guy. But this person, Chellappa, was, I think, a Tamil Brahmin, if I'm not wrong. And he ruled the Tamil regions during the Achyutaraya's reign. The Achyutaraya, the half-brother of Krishnadevaraya. So in the 1530s or so. So this person was fairly autonomous. And his income was in the order of 1 million gold pieces, if I'm not, that's what's mentioned by Bertenstein. I don't know what his source is. That was his income from taxation, right? And from the local Tamil chieftains. And he only paid a third of that income to the emperor, right? Only a third of the income went back to Hampi, right? The rest was retained by Chellappa to maintain his own army. And his own army comprised of 30,000 infantry, 3,000 horses, 30 war elephants, right? So you're talking about a fairly powerful ruler in the Tamil region who was, of course, he was definitely subordinate to the Vijayanagara Empire, but pretty independent for all practical purposes, right? Similarly, there was this person, Saluva Timmarasu, a Telugu Niyogi Brahmin who ruled much of the Andhra region during the same period, Achyutaraya, right? Apparently, he had an income of almost 800,000 gold coins in a year or something like that. I don't know how they measure this, but less than half of it went to the king, to the emperor in Vijayanagara. Right? The rest was retained by Timmarasu. Right? So I think this is interesting to note, right? The fact that maybe the centralized nature is sometimes overemphasized by the early historians, right?
Right. Moving on, what about arts and culture? What were the performing arts and what kind of art was patronized and promoted by the Vijayanagara Empire, and in what form that art and those cultural aspects still survive?
Yeah. So Krishnadevaraya's court is renowned for its Ashtadiggajas, right? The 8 great luminaries, so to speak. So he was definitely a patron of the arts, especially literature. And he himself was a literary figure. Right? As I mentioned, Krishnadevaraya has a place in the history of Telugu literature, right? With his great composition, Amukta Malyada, right? And in his court, you had people like Tenali Ramakrishna, who is, in popular perception, he's something like akin to Akbar-Birbal relationship, right? Tenali Ramakrishna is known for his witticisms and his jokes, etc. That's how he's known in popular terms. Having said that, Tenali Ramakrishna himself was a great Telugu poet of some repute, right? And in his court, there were other literary giants like Allasani Peddana, who's one of the great Telugu literary figures who composed this great Telugu work, Manu Charitramu, which is a story from Markandeya Purana adapted to Telugu. And it's regarded as one of the great Telugu poems, right? There was also a poet named Nandi Timmanna, right? So there were quite a few important figures in his court who contributed greatly to Telugu literature. And during Vijayanagara rule, there were many musical works also written. So I know we tend to think of Purandaradasa as the father figure of Carnatic music, and rightly so. And he also belongs very much to this period, right? But at the same time, there were also many theoretical works in music written in the Vijayanagara period. Purandaradasa was somebody whose kritis survive, whose compositions survive, but there were some treatises written as well by others in the same period. An example would be Bhandaru Lakshmi Narayana's Sangeeta Suryodaya. I think he was in Krishnadevaraya's court. It's probably one of the Ashtadiggajas, right? And then Sangeeta Kalanidhi by Kallinatha. There was a commentary on Sangeeta Ratnakara, the work, the Yadava period work that we mentioned in our previous episode by Vithaleshwara. Then Vidyaranya himself, the early Vijayanagara figure, he is credited with a work called Sangeeta Sara. All of these works are basically theoretical works on music, which suggests that what we regard as Carnatic music today, it's not as though it began with Purandaradasa, right? Though that is a popular perception. I'm sure there was a musical tradition prior to that, which is why all of these theoretical works are being written, right? It's just that the compositions prior to Purandaradasa have not survived in a big way. That's why we regard Purandaradasa as a founding figure of sorts. And he is nevertheless important because it's his pedagogy which still survives, right? I think he was one of the figures who kind of systematized the way Carnatic music is taught, and that continues. Even today, when somebody begins the Carnatic music lessons, some of the early songs that are taught to them are those of Purandaradasa, right? He's that influential. There's another figure in Andhra, Annamacharya, who I think lived in the vicinity of Tirupati. A lot of his compositions survive even to this day, and they're very popular, right? They're sung even today in concerts. Another interesting figure. So that's on music. And of course, literature we already covered, Telugu literature. I'm not sure if there were many great Kannada literary works written at this time. I think this was a period when I think Telugu rose to great prominence. And perhaps at the expense of Tamil and Kannada, right? That's fair. It's fair to say, because I think Tamil and Kannada are the two older languages of southern India, right? With much older histories, literary histories going back to early mid-first millennium, right? But this was a period when Telugu really came into its own, and that process had kind of started in the previous period itself. It was also a period of considerable migration of a lot of Telugu origin people into Tamil Nadu and into the deep south, right? And a lot of people movement also happened in this period during the Vijayanagara period. Right. So, I mean, when we think about this period, there's not a lot to talk about Tamil literature, Kannada literature, at least not to the same extent as Telugu literature, right? So we tend to discuss Telugu literature a lot in the context of this period, right? As far as the arts are concerned, the Dasara festival that we observe today in Mysore, which is so very big, that is basically a continuation of the Vijayanagara tradition, right? It is the Vijayanagara kingdoms who basically pioneered the celebration of Dasara in a big way. The Mahanavami festival, right? With 9 days of festivities, processions of elephants, and all that you see in Mysore today. That's basically a relic, a legacy of the Vijayanagara. Mysore carried forward the tradition which had been discontinued in Hampi, right? Following the fall of Hampi. You can put it that way, right? And the Mahanavani festivals are described in great detail by the Portuguese chroniclers, especially both of them, Domingo Pais and Nunes. They describe the festival in vivid detail. They describe what happens on each day, and much of it has some resonance even today in terms of what happens in Mysore. So that's one great legacy, I would say, a cultural legacy of the Vijayanagara period. The elevation of Dasara to the status of being the preeminent festival of the land, so to speak, right? Which probably was not the case before Vijayanagara. Yeah.
So about the literature, we talked about the Marathi literature which came up during this period in that Sultanate period. So I will not go back to that. So we talked about Jnaneshwar and Namdev and other saints.
Yeah.
Correct. Right. Any final thoughts, any closing comments on the end of the empire and how the empire lives on?
Yeah, so one thing which we did not discuss till now were the military innovations which were happening around this time. So in popular like knowledge, we tend to think of Babur as having pioneered the gun weaponry into artillery weaponry into India. So that was his decisive edge over the northern remnants of Delhi Sultanate and the Rajputs, which aided him in victory. But some other things, so these innovations had also come up in the south. So the remnants of Bahmani and Sultanate and the Adil Shahids, they had been using artillery against Vijayanagar. So that remained one of the, so to speak, weak points against of Vijayanagar, and that was also a contributing factor for Vijayanagar losing the Battle of Talikot, because the other side had artillery. And yeah, we also talked about horses and how Vijayanagar was importing horses from via Goa. So some economical historians, or I wouldn't say Marxist historians, so they have put some of the reasons for fall of Vijayanagar on the exorbitant prices the Vijayanagar rulers continued to pay for the imported horses, which resulted in exceeding, like excessive taxations, especially on the Konkan region, which also did not assist Vijayanagar, or help the Adil Shahis or the five Shahis. So that is also one theory some historians have had, that the import of horses and the additional burden that had on the exchequer was one of the reasons Vijayanagar finally declined. I am not sure, like that is the thing with such theories. We cannot ever be sure, but yeah, just wanted to put it out there.
Yeah.
Sure. Shrikanth, before we wrap it up, a couple of points wanted to pick your minds on. What about this school of mathematics that we often hear of, the Kerala school of mathematics? What was the contribution of Vijayanagara Empire in promoting it? And also some thoughts on the urban planning and what kind of science and technology went into building the cities of the Vijayanagara Empire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. On the Kerala School of Mathematics, it was very much a private effort in the Malabar region. Right? I don't think there was any sponsorship by anybody. But it's important to nevertheless discuss that school. And I know we started discussion of that school in one of the earlier episodes, right? Because it kind of overlaps with the previous period as well. But it's not as though there was any royal patronage, but so this school emerged in the Thrissur region of Kerala in the mid 14th century, and the pioneering figure was this person named Madhavacharya, Madhava Sangamagrama, right? And his own works have not survived, but his discoveries are published by his disciples, and that includes many things like sine series, cosine series, the infinite series for pi. Things that we learn from European sources much later, from the time of Leibniz or later, right? And then many of these identities were discovered by Madhava in the 1300s, right? And then in his tradition, you have many great mathematicians who emerged, and not just mathematicians, but also astronomers and astrologers, right? So one important figure is Nilakantha Somayyaji, who wrote commentary on Aryabhatiya, right? The work of the great classical mathematician Aryabhatta, and also a great work on astronomy named Tantra Sangraha, right? And there's a very interesting discussion between three Indian professors, including Mr. S. Ramasubramaniam, that was recently published and circulated by the Bhavna Journal. I can share it in the references that goes in depth into Tantra Sangraha and a lot of these texts, right? And then after Nilakantha Somayyaji, also another figure worth noting is Jeshtadeva, who wrote perhaps the most important work in this whole tradition. Its title is Yukti Bhasha. So this is a fascinating work. It was published around 1540, and it was in Malayalam. So that's one reason why it was probably neglected. So had it been in Sanskrit, it probably would have been translated and annotated much earlier, right? Because of the fact that it is in vernacular, it was perhaps neglected by Indologists, right, for a long time. And Yukti Bhasha was written by Jeshtadeva, and Jeshtadeva basically compiles the results of all of his predecessors, going all the way back to Madhava in the 1300s, right? And we tend to think of Indian mathematics as very abstract and not very rigorous, right? We tend to think Indian mathematicians just like to give identities. They don't prove anything. They just come up with formula in a verse, and that's it. And they let you figure out how they came up with it. Right? They don't bother with proofs. That's actually not true. In Yukti Bhasha, you have detailed mathematical proofs for things like sine infinite series, sine series, cosine series, the arctangent power series, a good 150 years before Leibniz. This is 1540. And perhaps he's only compiling things that are been a part of a long-standing tradition. So it's perhaps even older than that, right? So all these proofs exist in Yukti Bhasha, right? So it's interesting, and I think this needs to be known better. And I think a lot of people go overboard with this, and they say, "Hey, ideas of calculus were transmitted from Kerala to Europe." I mean, that can always be debated. I'm not sure if there's any basis for that, but that many of the great breakthroughs attributed to Leibniz in the 17th, breakthroughs did happen even in Kerala in a slightly independently about 150, 200 years before them. Yeah. Right.
Right. What about urban planning and any thoughts on the legal system that an empire that lasts over 200 years would have put in place?
Yeah. Urban planning is, I think, important to discuss because the city of Vijayanagara is, as we all know, it's a tourist spot today. The village of Hampi. The Vijayanagara city was perhaps, by some accounts, the second largest city in the world around the time of Krishnadevaraya, around 1520 or so. It was perhaps the second largest city in the world after Beijing. Right, and I think this is widely acknowledged, and this is based on Portuguese sources, right? I think that the likes of Domingo Pais, they are estimating the number of houses in Vijayanagara to be roughly 100,000. So with roughly 4 or 5 people per house, you get to a population of 500K, and I think this is also kind of corroborated by the digging and the archaeological evidence that has come through since then, right? So it was a very large city and a fairly well-planned city as well. During Krishnadevaraya's rule, he was also constructing a new city adjacent to Vijayanagara and by the name Hosapete, and that still exists today, the town of Hospet in Bellary district, right? The irony is that Hospet is now thriving, right? It is a town, whereas Vijayanagara is just in ruins, right? There's no settlement there besides a village, right? The city was planned well in the sense that it was on the banks of the Tungabhadra river. In the temple town, all the great temples in the town were to the north. So all the great temples we associate with Vijayanagara, the Virupaksha temple, the Ramachandra temple, the Vithala Swami temple, the ruins of which still exist today. They exist in the northern half of the town, whereas in the palace and the trading center were in the southern half, right, away from the river, and those regions have survived less well, right? I think a lot of looting happened post Battle of Talikota, where it was basically a free for all. Anybody could come and loot, right, if they had mercenaries. And many of the private mansions and palaces have not really survived, right? But the temples have kind of survived, I would say, right? And with respect to town planning, Krishnadevaraya, in fact, often took Portuguese help to construct major projects, to engage in major projects. Like, for instance, he built a canal. And I think constructed a lake and also built a dam as well as a canal, if I'm not wrong, in the town of Vijayanagara, which is attested by both Pais as well as Muniz. And this was done with the help of a Portuguese engineer. So he borrowed a Portuguese engineer to build this lake for him, right? And that basically provided irrigation for the surrounding areas, right? So there was definitely investment in public works. Right. Yeah. And and with respect to, I think you also mentioned law, right? Vijayanagara was very much a Hindu kingdom and very Brahminical in many ways, right? And the king was not actually a lawmaker. The king was not somebody who made laws. Rather, the tradition was very conservative in the sense that the laws that were followed, those of the Hindu law, the Yagyavalkya Smriti, the Parashara Smriti, right? And the commentaries on those ancient digests were heeded to with great attention, right? And the king also acknowledged that, right? It's not as though the ruler could do what he likes, right? The tradition was pretty conservative with respect to how the law was enforced, right? It was a fairly traditional Hindu kingdom, right? And I think it is not unfair to view Vijayanagara as a major Hindu project, so to speak, right? Though they did have Muslims in their army, right? I'm not denying all of that, and of course they collaborations sometimes with some of the Muslim Shahis and even with the Portuguese, but broadly speaking, it is fair to view Nagara as representing this last hope for the Orthodox Hindu cause in southern India, so to speak, right? And their kings were devoutly Hindu right till the end, right? And we often, it's also worthwhile to note the society back then was perhaps very different from what we imagine it to be today. For instance, sati was pretty common, and this is attested by both, I think, Pays and newness, especially newness, not Pays, but newness, right? We tend to think sati is something that happened only in northern India among the Rajputs. It's not quite true. Sati was definitely practiced, and it was reasonably common, I think, even in the Vijayanagara Empire, right? And this is attested by these chroniclers, and I don't see why they should lie about it, right? And in one place, I spoke about the construction of the tank and the lake by Krishnadevaraya, right? In one of those cases, I think the tank often ended up with many holes in it, and it was there were many issues with the maintenance of the tank. And Krishnadevaraya consulted his Brahmins to understand why they're having this issue, and the Brahmin suggested sacrifice on a large scale to solve the problem, right? And that apparently included human sacrifice, right? And this is also attested in the Portuguese sources that humans were sacrificed in this context, right? It's interesting. It's very hard for us to digest these things. It must have been a very different society from how we imagine it to be, right? So much of that Hindu culture is still very much our culture, but there are aspects to that culture which we don't relate to today, and things have changed quite a bit, right? And things like human sacrifice, it's mentioned in the Portuguese sources, maybe not as much in the Indian sources, right? So are the Portuguese making it up? Are they exaggerating things? These things can always be debated depending on what your biases are. So, it's interesting that I thought it's worth mentioning these little anecdotes. Right? The sacrifice on occasion in the core Vijayanagara territory. Right? I don't know how accurate that is, but it's interestingly mentioned by both Newness Pays. Yeah.
Yeah, so coming to that, around this time, around the 14th, 15th, 16th century, so there are documented references to a practice of sacrificing a couple before building a great fort in Maharashtra region. Something which some historians say was stopped after the Maratha Empire rose under Shivaji and so on. So there are some references even in the north, not just Vijayanagar. So again, it's the references are far and few between, so we cannot say either way confidently. But yeah, as Shrikanth said, just something worth remembering that the society back then was drastically different than what we imagine, maybe because we tend to put our biases back on them and only own up to the aspects which are palatable to us today.
Correct. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, much of it we can relate to, right? But there are things that we don't relate to, right? And we get a feel for that from the Portuguese sources. But again, the reliability of those sources can be questioned.
Yeah. And one interesting thing just worth adding, Shrikant just talked about the sack of Hampi, after the loss of Battle of Talikot. So Hampi was not known, and it was rediscovered by a British botanist called Alexander Hamilton in the 19th or early 20th century. So
In the
it was
19th century. Yeah.
yeah, so it was lost, and there was no the remnants of Vijayanagara. They moved, I think, down south or southeast, right? They left their base from Hampi after
Yeah, I mean,
the
you had
fourth
post
dynasty.
Vijayanagara, many of the principalities of the Vijayanagara Empire, they became independent. So you had the emergence of the Vadayars, the Mysore Vadayars, right? Who existed till independence, right? And the Mysore Wadayar dynasty still exists, right? You still have a prince there. In the dynastic line is still there. They are still in charge of the Dasara festivities every year. And then you had the emergence of the Nayakas in Madurai, who greatly contributed to the development of Madurai in late medieval times, the enlargement of the Madurai temple, right? So they were also originally subordinate to the Vijayanagara Empire, but they became independent in the 17th century.
Yeah.
Right.
And also one thing worth noting, the royal emblem of Vijayanagar was it consists of 3-4 things: a crescent moon, sword, an old Indian style sword, not a scimitar but a straight tapering sword, a boar, which
The Varaha, yeah.
Varaha, yeah. But it is not the Varaha human form, like not the Vishnu avatar. It's a boar, so to speak.
Yeah, I think there is
A
speculation
four-legged
on
boar.
that. Or have they borrowed the Varaha from the old Chalukya
Yeah, so we cannot.
Badami emblem or from the Kakatiyas, right? I think there's some debate on that.
Yeah, but it is a proper four-legged boar. Not not the Gupta Varaha or other Varahas which were seen in northern India during the first millennium. And they also had a son somewhere. So, but the boar was the emblem.
No, fascinating. Now, on this point of how we put our biases and the way we live our lives on people who lived 500 years ago, possibly 500 years down the line, when all meat is factory produced, people will be scandalized thinking we were going around killing real animals and eating them up. Right.
Yeah,
So,
it's interesting on how we handle evidence, right? For instance, we can't pick and choose and take all the good things that the Portuguese say about Krishnadevaraya and the city of Hampi, all the praise they heap on the
Magnificence,
city,
yeah.
and ignore the mention of human sacrifice or sati, right? We can't do that, right? So either we ditch the Portuguese sources completely, or we take the good with the not so good, all right? The things that I shouldn't use good and not so, because that involves value judgment, but we should be open to things that we are uncomfortable with as well.
Interesting you say that, because the next episode we plan to do is on Mughals. And if there is one debate in this country as to what we should pick up and what we should not pick up from the Mughals, if that isn't a debate, then I think there is no debate in this country.
Yeah.
Fine.
So even to the Battle of Talikot, so that is also that also has a political resonance today. So one popular history which is known, at least in some circles in India, I am not sure how accurate that thing is the Vijayanagara Empire lost because two Muslim generals or commanders, they defected to the other side during the end of the battle, or they did not participate in the battle. So many historians think that was not a game changer. Vijayanagar was going to lose, but that particular incident in history has come up sharply in political narratives, like the Battle of Panipat. So, yeah.
Right. But on that, I think the defection of the Muslims and also criticism of Ramaraya for having recruited Muslims in crucial positions, that is there even in some of the older sources, in the primary sources. Like I think one of the Italian travelers at that time, Sare Federici, he notes this defection. Right. So maybe it's not complete. It's not complete speculation. There might be some basis to it.
Yes, so there probably was defection. I'm just not sure how much that had an impact on the final outcome of the battle.
fair.
Like in case of Panipat, where it is more clear, where the political framing was like, we'll come to that later, but this was more like, it is more speculative, a bit more speculative than Panipat.
A bit more speculative. Yes, true.
Right. So wrapping up the episode, how does the empire end? What are the three reasons that are typically consensus reasons for the empire coming to an end?
Yeah. So I think at least going by the traditional accounts, a lot of the blame is placed on this one person who named Ramaraya, right? So Ramaraya was actually the son-in-law of Krishnadevaraya, right? So after Krishnadevaraya's death in the early 1530s, I think, he was succeeded by his half-brother, because Krishnadevaraya didn't have any grown sons. So he was succeeded by his half-brother, Achyutaraya, who ruled for some time. But Achyutaraya was always up against Ramaraya, who was Krishnadevaraya's son-in-law, right? And there was always this conflict between Ramaraya and Achyutadevaraya. And Achyutaraya was, I think, imprisoned by Ramaraya, and Ramaraya installed a young infant, if I'm not wrong, as a king, and he ruled as a proxy. Right? And this continued for a long time. I don't think Ramaraya himself was ever crowned. So he was basically the power behind the crown, so to speak, right? And he was very influential. I think a lot of historians criticize Ramaraya for his friendliness to Muslims, maybe, and he recruited Muslims in many important positions in the army, right? And in that, he was not doing something new, because even 100 years before him, Devaraya had started this practice of recruiting Muslims in the army, right? But I think Ramaraya recruited them in some pretty important positions, and some at least the nationalist Hindu historians, they view that as being a cause of Vijayanagara's defeat, right? But again, the criticality of that can be questioned, as Gaurav mentioned, right? With respect to the Battle of Talikota itself, was there a technology differential between Vijayanagara and its opponents? I'm not super well read on that, so I wouldn't comment on that, right? So maybe Gaurav can expand on that if he has any points.
So there was an advantage, but that had existed at least 2030, or even during the Battle of Raichur, which Krishnadevaraya won. There was a technology advantage with the Bahmanis, but Vijayanagar managed to win that one, but only to lose 30 years down the line. Shrikanth mentioned about Ramaraya recruiting Muslims in higher posts. One thing is not, so another popular way of looking at it is the Vijayanagara Empire was seen to be meddling a lot in the Bahmani, the Dakkani Sultanate, 5 sultanates. So the sultanates were always at war with each other, and Bahmanis took a side with one of, like, especially the side with Adil Shahi against the other two Shahis they were fighting. So there was a lot of political Game of Thrones going on. But what Ramaraya is said to have achieved is managed to unite the 5 against the 1. So that was sort of the political blunder. He may have obviously not wanted to do that, but there are some reports that his political failings of maybe participating in the internal politics of sultanates, and like pissing them all off so that they come up united against the Vijayanagar, because they did not remain united long after the Vijayanagar fell. So they went back to their fighting. But the unity is always seen as the Islamic Ummah unity against the Hindu Vijayanagar in at least some of the nationalist circles. But I don't think it would be completely fair to look at that unity only as a Islamic unity. So there were some political blunders as well, which Vijayanagar committed, which gave rise to that.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's a good note to sort of wrap up this episode, because now the territory and the era that we've entered in the history of subcontinent, it's a theme that will come up again and again. And I think if we were to talk of post 1947 also, we can have these arguments and debates. This was lovely. Any closing comments, gentlemen?
No, I think we summed up the whole period pretty well.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Shrikanth. With that, we wrap up the episode on Vijayanagara Empire. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank
Bye.
you.